It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Post December 4th, how did CPD and Hanrahan try to cover up the assassination of Chairman Fred?
Well, they charged all the survivors with attempted murder, claiming in their public statements were how they had opened fire and continued to fire. As Flint said, the physical evidence didn't support that. They claimed, their crime lab claimed that 2 shotgun shells came from a weapon they identified as being in the lap of Brenda Harris. So that was the only evidence they had that any of the survivors had ever fired. Upon examination of that more closely with our expert and actually an FBI expert, those 2 shotgun shells came from a police weapon. And they, in fact, didn't have any other characteristics. It was not a legitimate mistake. It was an attempt by the crime lab, as we found in many heater cases. The crime lab comes up with the evidence that supports the police theory of what happened. But anyway, when that was dissolved, there was no evidence that any of the survivors fired. And so they dropped the charges on December 18th, sometime later. We had gotten Deborah out where she had her baby. So the charges were dropped, but we had 4 people shot. Doc Satchel was in the middle bedroom, and he had the machine gun bullets in his colon. He had to have several surgeries, and I'm not sure he ever completely recovered his health. They had shot this machine gun through a wall where there were 3 Panthers sleeping, and all of them were shot, but Doc had the worst wounds by far. And so we were, of course, pleased that the charges were dropped, but it wasn't quite, we weren't satisfied. So people said to us, and we had just started our office, what about a civil rights suit? You've got to sue them. You've got to find out who and what happened. And we had mostly done a little criminal work. We'd never really been in federal court. We got a lot of support from some of the Lawyers Guild, experienced lawyers. Arthur Kanoy in particular came and said, you can do this. We fought civil rights in the South. We found ways to get into federal court when we had to. And so with his help and some help from the NAACP, we filed a civil suit in the spring of 1970. And we sued Hanrahan because the raiders were attached to him, his police. We sued the raiders. We sued the crime lab for this phoning up this investigation. And we also sued the investigative agency, which, as you probably know, in all of these police shoot-ups, there's usually a cover-up and often a phony investigations. Other cops, the police lie and cover each other up, and there's this code of silence. So they basically said that what the police had done was justified. So we started that civil rights suit, as I said, in the spring of 1970. We drew a very racist judge who grew up in Alabama, who didn't want to hear about police brutality and much less police murder. And so that began our legal saga. I'll let Flint take it from there.
Well, early on, Hanrahan was in command of the narrative. And he had a press conference where he claimed that it was a shootout, that 200 bullets had been fired and the Panthers fired half of them. And there were 4 newspapers at that time in Chicago, and they all went along with it. It was a major, major, major story in every media outlet in Chicago. And there was a turning point, one among many. And the first turning point was when a reporter from one of the papers, the Sun-Times, wrote an article after he came to the apartment and saw that it was a shoot-in. And he wrote an article saying that, basically. And the Sun-Times editors put it on page 43. He quit. And his action in quitting caused the editor of the Sun-Times to come to the apartment at night with his wife dressed out from the opera in a fur. And we showed her and him what really happened. And from that point on, the Sun-Times and the Daily News, which was two of the papers, they were connected one morning and one afternoon, started to tell the real story, or the portion of the real story that was known at that time. The Chicago Tribune, a historically racist and reactionary Republican paper, and its secondary paper continued to trumpet the Hanrahan story. And so Hanrahan fought back by doing an exclusive where he gave the cops stories and let the cops be interviewed by the Tribune. And to kind of gild the lily and the false stories, he gave them pictures, and he gave pictures that they said showed 2 bullet holes in the back where Fred Hampton supposedly fired at the police, and a wall or a door that was riddled with bullets, which they said were fired by the Panthers. Well, we knew those were false, and we knew we could prove it by the apartment itself, because the bullet holes were in fact nail heads, and the bullet riddled door was a door that had been open against a wall where the machine gun bullets went through, and we had put dowels through so we could show the trajectory. So we were able to blow up Hanrahan's exclusive, and we also had Deborah Akua and others spoke to the media about what really happened. So that started to change the narrative in December, and as Jeff said, they continued with the cover-up in other aspects of it. And in fact, as we can talk about later, portions of the cover-up, the true nature of the FBI's involvement, the depth of the FBI's involvement, was successfully covered up for a few years, and as it turns out, continues to this day.
And following on from that into the trial, could you guys give me a brief overview of, I know it was a very long trial, a brief overview of the trial, and what the media, how the media break in and the revelation of COINTELPRO, did it actually help you guys in the trial?
And after we got this floor plan that O'Neill had drawn to show where Fred Hampton would be sleeping, and had passed it on to his control agent who headed up the Racial Matters Squad in Chicago. This became the basis of the raid, as it turned out. So we first got that document. We then questioned O'Neill about his role. We questioned Mitchell, the agent, about his role. And we fought, as Jeff said, very hard to get the COINTELPRO documents. Ultimately, even though the judge was resisting us getting the documents, we were able to get them because there was a parallel investigation going on in post-Watergate by Senator Church. And he had, and his investigation had uncovered COINTELPRO documents that showed that there was a connection between COINTELPRO and the raid on the Panther apartment. And I was able to get that committee to give me those documents. So now we had the documents, and we knew that the judge and the government were covering up the fact that COINTELPRO was behind the raid of Fred Hampton's apartment. So ultimately, we were able to get that document out. It showed that on December 3rd, 1969, the day before the raid, that the Bureau had taken credit for the impending raid and said it was part of the COINTELPRO program. So now we had a floor plan, and we had this document that showed that it was part of COINTELPRO, the raid on the Panther apartment. So we went to trial in early 1976, and during the trial, it was discovered that the government was covering up some 200 volumes of FBI documents that were pertinent to the Panthers in Chicago and were pertinent to Fred Hampton and to the raid. And we finally, in the last volume of those 200 volumes of documents that were produced during our trial, we got the third document, which we call the trilogy, that showed and documented that the raid was part of the COINTELPRO program, and it was a raid to assassinate Fred Hampton as a political leader. And that document we called the bonus document. So we got a document that showed that the FBI in Washington had arranged for a bonus for O'Neill for setting up the raid, which they called a success. And they also said the floor plan was of tremendous value, which the raiders could not get from any other source. So this $300, which we called the 30 pounds of silver, like Judas got, was further evidence of this conspiracy to assassinate Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. So we had a trilogy of documents. We had the floor plan that showed that the FBI and O'Neill and Mitchell had in fact diagrammed the place, the apartment where Fred Hampton would be sleeping, including the bed that he was sleeping on. We had the COINTELPRO document dated December 3rd that said that the raid the next day would be part of the COINTELPRO program of the FBI. And now, in the middle of the trial, we got the third part of the trilogy, which was the bonus document.
Despite all of this, when you guys tried to bring in J. Edgar Hoover, Mitchell, and some other people in the FBI, it wasn't allowed, despite the very concrete evidence that they were involved.
They didn't want us to go up the ladder. We had pretty good evidence or suspicion because the bonus document was from Hoover to O'Neill at that point, and it appeared that the people higher up were involved. So we wanted to find that out, and we wanted to add Moore and Sullivan. Moore was the head of Sullivan was the head of domestic intelligence. Moore was in head of extremism. And actually, Flint went and took the depositions of those people to learn more, but they pretty much stonewalled, and because of the judge had said it couldn't come in, the U.S. attorney wouldn't let them answer questions about the role of COINTELPRO. So what we could have gone up perhaps to Hoover and maybe even to Mitchell and Nixon, who certainly were informed of the raid afterward, if not informed of its likely coming before. But the judge would not allow us to name those people. And so actually recently recovered documents would have made that easier, because documents that just came out in December, 51 years later, show that not only did O'Neill get a bonus, but Mitchell got a bonus, and that his bonus was approved by Moore and Sullivan, and that the process was actually started at the time they were giving the floor plan and the information to Hanrahan's police. So it wasn't just they came in afterwards and congratulated them. It looks like Hoover and Moore and Sullivan were following this course as it took place. They saw that Hanrahan was a very ambitious prosecutor, the heir apparent to Daley, and so they gave it to him, and he was more than a willing participant. I think he thought his political career would benefit from a raid on the Panthers, and it actually ended his political career.
J. Edgar Hoover, of course, we know was the architect of COINTELPRO. And as hard as it seemed at first to picture that Hoover would be, and his higher ups, Moore and Sullivan, would be following what was going on in Chicago with O'Neill on almost a day-to-day basis. That's what these documents that have come out seem to show. So as Jeff said, we were fighting very hard to join Hoover and Moore and Sullivan in the conspiracy at the time, back in the 1976, and also John Mitchell. We have two Mitchells in the case. John Mitchell, who was the notorious Attorney General under Nixon, who was convicted of Watergate corruption. And we have, of course, Roy Mitchell, the agent here in Chicago. But it was remarkable to 51 years later get another trove of documents after we thought that the narrative had been set back in the late 80s or early 80s when we resolved the 13 years of litigation with a settlement for the families of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton and also the survivors. But as we can see, the depth of the conspiracy, of the assassination, of the government not only sponsored but ratified assassination of an important and charismatic Black leader, that evidence, there's still more evidence of it. And as lawyers in the case and as historians who have both written about this extensively, this is important for us to talk about, and it's important for the public to know, to understand that when you talk about the FBI's role, you're talking about not only agents and informants at the local level, but you're talking about the top at the FBI, and that their scheme was nationwide. And in fact, Fred Hampton fit right into the center of the conspiracy to destroy the Black Panther Party and to prevent the rise of messiahs who could electrify and unify the movement and bring different organizations and aspects of the movement together to fight against the state.
So with literally 51 years later, new files still coming out, do you guys believe we've seen the full extent to what COINTELPRO did to the movement?
No, I think there are redactions, unbelievably, 51 years later. In other words, even these documents have hidden things, some of which we can sort of figure out. One was an instruction to an FBI agent that if he were called before the state grand jury, if he were asked any questions about blank, redacted, he was to immediately leave the grand jury and report to his superior. So this was at a time when the community had demanded investigations. There was a federal investigation that never uncovered the federal role. Then there was a state investigation, and the agent was specifically told, don't answer any questions about the federal involvement. This is over a year later. The federal role had never been disclosed. And in fact, if that burglary at the FBI office, or if O'Neill hadn't been uncovered, we might never know about COINTELPRO. And so these new documents also show that the FBI continued to congratulate the control agent, Roy Mitchell, for the next 6 months, giving him more bonuses, telling him that his work with the informant was so critical to the mission of the FBI. So internally, the FBI is taking great credit. Publicly, they're denying any role in what happened. So, and there are, as I mentioned, redactions here. So, and we also mentioned we never got to what did Mitchell tell, what did Hoover tell John Mitchell, the Attorney General, before or after the raid? Sort of what did you know and when did you know it? So those things aren't known. Bobby Rush has asked the Biden administration to turn over the complete FBI files, or says he's going to do that. And I suspect there's more that we don't know, that still needs to be uncovered.
Mm. And with the context of what was going on, how the FBI were systematically dismantling the Black Panthers across the nation. When you hear of a story like Assata Shakur's, do you guys believe the official documentation, the New Jersey State Troopers version of events?
I don't see how you can believe their version of events any more than you could believe Hanrahan's version of the events. And I think that in terms of when you have situations where revolutionary or radical liberation fighters such as Assata, such as Fred Hampton, and other Black leaders, messiahs, as it were, who come in to conflict with and confrontation with the police and with the government, that the government and the police are going to put out a narrative, and they're going to put out that narrative both publicly and in the courts after they charge people such as Assata, and as they charge the Panthers here in Chicago. And once again, like we have all fought to establish the true narrative with regard to the Fred Hampton assassination, I think the true narrative in the other confrontations, whether it be in New Jersey or whether it be in L.A. with the raid on the L.A. offices 4 days after the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, that you cannot accept the government or the police narrative of any of these events.
Thank you, guys. And one last, kind of bringing it forward, a lot of people I've spoken to, there's still what they believe a COINTELPRO type program is currently happening, targeting Black activists and what they're now calling, whereas they used to be Black nationalist hate groups, they're calling them Black identity extremists. What you guys' thoughts and perspectives on that?
Well, the formal COINTELPRO program ended shortly after it became public, but the efforts of the FBI to surveil and harass and repress the movement certainly didn't. And as you mentioned, the term back then was Black nationalist hate groups, which when I inquired what that was, the FBI said it's a Black group with a national headquarters. So it's pretty broad. And today, a Black identity extremist probably is anybody who supports Black Lives Matter or any kind of freedom or independence for Black people. And we see similarities between what happened then, and in particular in places like Ferguson, we see all kinds of methodology used there, weaponry, tear gas, concussion brigades, weaponry that in the streets that probably was developed by Israeli or Palestinians, and that gets imported here. Our police get trained by the IDF in Israel. I was a lawyer up at Standing Rock, and we saw similar tactics used. They added a new one where they actually used private security firm, Tiger Swan, to provide intelligence and counterintelligence to infiltrate the water protectors or try to create false frictions and things like that. So I don't think in any way the FBI still sees these movements for progressive change any less of a threat. And I think they've become more sophisticated, both in their means of surveillance and in the tactics they use in the street. And of course, social media opens up a whole other ability to surveil and use the movement, use what people say against them sometimes. So it's alive and well today. And also most recently, we of course have seen the infiltration of right-wing white supremacist groups into the police. So certainly they bring with them their own anti-left and anti-Black sentiments. So you add that nastiness to the police techniques, and you can imagine the kind of things that happen.
there's a parallel with regard to COINTELPRO and the FBI working with local police, and Jeff touched on that, which is the parallel of white supremacist groups infiltrating police, and conversely, the police being part of white supremacist groups. And I was able to work in the South in the early 80s in a case where 5 anti-Klan demonstrators were massacred not by the police, but by the Nazis and the Klan. And it turned out that a police informant had led the caravan that led the massacre, and that he was not only a police informant, but he was a former FBI informant. And we saw that throughout the 60s in the South of FBI informant provocateurs being at the forefront of Klan violence against civil rights workers. And we saw it again in terms of the police and white supremacist cooperation and collaboration in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, when there was a major attack on demonstrators there, which led to the death of one demonstrator at the hands of white supremacists. And now we see it again with regard to the Capitol, whatever you want to call it, insurrection, riot, coup, whatever the terminology that you choose to call it, that the more that it starts to come out, we see police cooperation, we see police coming from other parts of the country, military from coming to join the attack on the Capitol, and we see that informants were in fact in those white supremacist organizations and were involved in leading the charge. So it's another aspect of this ongoing government repression here in this country that becomes more sophisticated as the technology becomes more sophisticated.